What if college football conferences were based on NIL spending? You might have heard Mike Gundy saying that the Ducks should not have even played Oklahoma State last week because they had so much more money spent on their roster than Oklahoma State could. He said something to the effect of Oregon had spent $40 million on their roster last season, and Oklahoma State hadn't even spent $7 million over the past 3 seasons. Now, I don't know if this was kind of some sideways shot at his boosters for restructuring his contract because his team was so bad last season, or if he genuinely thinks that teams that don't spend enough money shouldn't be able to play the top teams in the country because it's an uneven matchup. But I took him at face value. Let's take a look and see what conferences would look like if all that separated teams was how much they spent on their individual rosters. Let's look at the first tier, and then I'll tell you where we're getting this information and how we're deciding to separate these teams. So first, we have Texas, LSU, Illinois, Indiana, Notre Dame, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Auburn, Clemson, Florida State, Miami, Michigan State, Michigan, Oklahoma, Oregon, Penn State, Ohio State, Tennessee, Texas A&M, USC, and Virginia. I would say there's 2 real surprising teams and 1 super surprising team in this top tier. The 2 real surprising teams are Illinois and Indiana. I know they're both Big Ten teams, but they haven't really had that historic success. Obviously, they're both top 20 teams as we speak, and Indiana did have that playoff appearance last season, but it's still a bit surprising to see them up with the big dogs like Texas, LSU, Ohio State, Michigan. But the super surprising team is Virginia, and that's because they haven't really had any success in college football. They have had some success in college basketball, winning a national championship within the past 10 seasons, but even that has been a while since they've done that. So it's really surprising to see that they are a part of this group here, especially when you take into account what we're basing this tier off of, which is total booster contributions to the entire athletic department from 2023 and 2024. I got this from a site called NIL-NCAA, and I'll link them in the description below. But essentially what they've done is put together a list of all public Power 5 universities and put their total funding from NIL collectives, from contributions directly to the school, and any ticket sales to get an idea of what the total funding for their entire athletic department would be. And there's some really interesting findings here. Of course, these are estimates, but they are based on public findings. There's not going to be any exact data as we speak. We will get more of this data as we go further into the NIL/revenue sharing era. Obviously, the revenue sharing is going to be pretty well public data, and the NIL Go platform, although I do have problems with how they may end up using it, it will give us more concrete idea and should in the future give us exact ideas about how much money is going into these programs, which would make something like this more of a possibility or a realistic possibility in the future if they do want to go this route, which they're eventually going to go this route anyway with how they're going to put together these conferences. But one of the most interesting findings is how we talked about Virginia not really seeming like they would belong in that top tier. And when you look at them, they don't have the collective funding that would put them on the top tier. They kind of have a collective funding that would put them in the top tier. They definitely don't have ticket sales that would put them in the top tier. They're by far the lowest of anybody in this list, close to Illinois. But they are still top 5 in total contributions between their collective funding and contributions directly to their athletic program when you take out ticket sales. That is very interesting because they definitely don't have the success that other programs in the top tier, let alone the top of the top tier, have had. Someday they're going to put together a graph that's going to put how much spending goes into an athletic program and then what the output is as far as wins and losses, bowls, championships, all these kinds of things. And Virginia is going to be in the bottom right quadrant, which is never the quadrant that you want to be in one of those graphs. One thing to point out is that there was no private school data on this list that I was working from. So I did find some information around total athletic department spending for the private universities, and that's why teams like Notre Dame, Miami, USC, Stanford, Vanderbilt, Boston College, teams that are Power 5 programs but are private universities, have found their way on this list because I wanted to put all Power 5 teams into this group here. It's going to be too hard to find the G5 collective spending and all that kind of stuff. But for at least the Power 5, we can get a good idea of what the separation would look like. And of course, G5 teams would most likely all be at the bottom of the list, even if we did include them. So we've got a total of 3 tiers here. Let's go through the last 2 tiers, then I'll kind of go through the methodology of scheduling and how this would work in reality if it was ever put into practice. But before we get there, make sure that you like and subscribe. And if you're watching on mobile, go ahead and hype this video. It's a little feature you got on the bottom there, a new feature on YouTube. It's super helpful to small content creators like myself to get us on a leaderboard and get some more views and get us shown to more people than we would on a normal video. So next we've got our second tier, and this is our mid-tier Power 5 spenders. We've got Washington, Virginia Tech, Utah, South Carolina, Ole Miss, Arizona State, Vanderbilt, TCU, Texas Tech, SMU, North Carolina, Arkansas, Stanford, Kentucky, Louisville, Minnesota, Mississippi State, Missouri, Baylor, Iowa State, Duke, Iowa, Kansas, Kansas State, and BYU. One thing to point out here is after having no teams in the top tier, the Big 12 has 9 teams in this second tier. That gives a good idea of why those teams are still in the Big 12 and haven't been pulled up to conferences like the Big 10 or the SEC. It also gives a good idea of why many people think that the ACC, that has 5 teams in the top tier, might be in trouble in this next bout of conference realignment, where the Big 12 is pretty safe to stay intact as it has been because those ACC teams are spending to get into those bigger conferences. Finally, our third tier, and it consists of Wisconsin, Wake Forest, UCLA, Syracuse, Rutgers, Pitt, West Virginia, Arizona, Houston, Nebraska, Northwestern, Oregon State, Oklahoma State, NC State, Maryland, Georgia Tech, Purdue, UCF, Colorado, Boston College, Cal, Cincinnati, and Washington State. One thing to note here is there are no SEC teams in the bottom tier. All the SEC teams are either in the first or second tier, while there are tons of Big Ten teams here in this bottom tier. So there are some top spenders in the Big Ten, of course, but the SEC from top to bottom is spending a lot on their programs, which speaks to the depth that they're always reminding us about in their conference in a lot of different sports now. Okay, so these are not ironclad divisions. This is working off a website that's working off of estimates. So these are just giving us an idea of who the top spenders are and who the least spenders are in Power College athletics. But of course, there are definitely some idiosyncrasies within each of these. Some of these teams are spending more on football while other teams are spending more on other sports. But this gives us a good idea of who would be in what division. Exact specifics, you can argue about that in the comments. But let's talk about how scheduling would work, in my mind, in a setup like this. So if the idea is to get teams to play against other teams that are spending similarly and therefore would have a similar competitive balance, then we want those teams to be playing in that division. I believe with these large conferences of 22, 23, and 24 teams respectively, there should be a lot of games that can be played that would be different each given year. I think that each team should play at least 7 games within their division, within their conference. Let's call those the conference games. Each team should be playing at least 7 games within their spending conference. And then non-conference games, at least 3 of those non-conference games should come from a tier 1 below. So these top teams, they can't just go 7 teams in the top tier and then 5 teams that are either in the bottom tier or not in any of the tiers. They need to play 3 games from teams from that second tier. There are still some very good teams in there, and those are those teams. They have quite a few of them that would just peak up to the top of their conference in those top conferences, as opposed to being the stalwart powerhouses that we see in this top division. And then they have 2 additional games that they could play against anybody. You could include those games against top teams. You could include those games against FCS teams, against G5 teams, against bottom tier teams. Whatever you want to do with those 2 games, that's all you. But 10 of your games, if you're one of these top tier teams, should be coming against the top tier or the second tier, and 7 of those games would come against the top tier itself. Now, controversially, I think that the playoffs should have 16 teams in this particular setup, and probably 10 of those teams should come from the top division. Because if you're playing those schools 7 times in any given season, you are having the most difficult schedule in the country. Even if a second tier team was to take all of their non-conference games, which would include 5 different games, and play them all against top-tier conference teams, they're not going to have a schedule that replicates or is equal to those top teams. Maybe one season you end up getting Illinois, Virginia, Indiana, and what, Florida State on a down year, even though they look good, Clemson on a down year, like one of the ACC teams, or Michigan State, if you could somehow finagle that, then maybe there's an argument. But still, that's a very rare occurrence given that there's 22 teams that you're only going to take 7 from. It'd be very rare for you to get all of the lower end teams. And even those teams are not the lower end spending wise. It's just that their performance on the football field is not that great. So you would have to take a majority of the teams from the top division. Then you probably take 3 from the second, leaving 3 leftover spots, and those would go to the bottom tier. Or maybe you do 4 and then 2 from the bottom tier. It's interesting to see how that would play out. But again, I don't think that this is a good idea. I don't think that you should separate teams based on spending. Because yeah, it seems like it would level out the playing field, but that's not what college football is about. That's never been what college football is about. It's not about leveling out the playing field. It's about the best teams year in and year out fighting for a national championship, and an enormous pool of teams that are nowhere near equal the top teams in college football getting a chance to also do that same thing. That was the truth for all the years of the newspaper poll. Even though it rarely happened, there were a lot more different teams that would move in, but then we're talking about a 70, 80-year span as opposed to, 30 years that we've had these actual national championship games going back to like the Bowl Alliance. And if you think about it, in modern college football with the expanded playoff, there's more of a chance than ever for true underdog stories to have a chance at the national championship. If you think about it, there's only been really one true underdog story that's even succeeded in the national level, postseason level, in any time that I can remember, and that was Boise State in 2008. And that was the Fiesta Bowl. It wasn't even the national championship. It was just a BCS Bowl. Even Cincinnati, who made it to the playoff in the 14 playoff, they got their ass kicked right away. They weren't able to get it done. But now with the 12-team playoff, if there is a team that is truly exceptional, that comes from outside of the mainstream of college football, they have a true chance at actually winning it. Obviously, Boise State didn't pull it off last season. Maybe they would have in 2008 if there's a 12-team playoff. Maybe USF can find a way to pull it off this season. It looks like they might have a true top-level team after 2 weeks. Obviously, we'll see a lot better this week coming up against Miami. But they have players, and they've been making plays that show that they're one of the top teams in the country, at least thus far. And they will have a chance this season. And as we expand the playoff more, that should only continue. It shouldn't be that we separate the top and bottom teams just so that you can win more games in a season, even if you're in a down season and you're Oklahoma State. It should be about the top teams are going to be the top teams. But in seasons where you can put together a team that really can compete, even if you're one of the worst teams every other season, but you find a way as one of these smaller schools to put it all together, we should be making college football we should allow those teams to show that off and be at the top levels if they can cobble it together and become that. And I think that even NIL spending is making that more possible. We're seeing players that go to these bigger schools that if for whatever reason it doesn't work out, they can go make a little money at another school and be the best player at that school and actually have a reason to go there other than just their career has crashed out. They actually have a reason to go there and prove themselves, and they have a chance to get games on the national spotlight because they can get that team to the conference championship, get them to the college football playoff, and find a way to maybe show an NFL team what they really can do if they get some playing time. So what Mike Gundy is suggesting, although I'm sure it's a bit facetious and I'm sure it's a bit of a jab at his boosters, it is a stupid idea. But thanks for watching that video. Make sure that you like and subscribe and hype this video if you're watching on mobile. That's super helpful to me as a smaller content creator. If you made it this far, make sure that you leave a comment. Let me know what you think. Is there anything that you would change to the size of the tiers? Are there any teams that you think are actually top spenders or don't make as much as I estimated them to spend? And is there anything that you would change in college football that I can make a video about in the future? If you want to watch more of my videos, I do have this for you. I made a little bit of a different video last week, which was a draft of the other conferences from the SEC and the Big Ten. So if you're interested in what teams might move into those bigger conferences in the next stage of realignment, that's an interesting way to look at it there. Other than that, I got my most popular video up here, which is the Perfect Power 5. Go ahead and check that one out if you haven't seen it already. Other than that, I've got my subscribe link on this side, and we will check you next time. See ya!